Hello everyone, today we talk about the Drang, Nach, Osten and Teutonic Prussia. So this is the first time I discuss this topic on my channel, and this is gonna be also a bit introductory. I'm not gonna discuss yet in detail the story of Teutonic Prussia, but I'll rather frame it into the general expansion of the so-called Drang nach Osten, that is essentially the push towards the east, also known as the Ostsiedlung, that, as you understand, these are old German historiographical concepts that revolve this definitely the expansion of not just of Germany. I mean, chiefly it started from the German lands, but let's say it's part of the broader extension of the Western world during the Low Middle Ages towards other areas that of the continent that at the time were rather, let's say, wild, environmentally speaking. That could be claimed back from the forests, from the swamps, and transformed into arable lands. And this is part of in turn of a much greater process it's a consequence of the great demographical and economical expansion of Europe, started back actually in the high, or not early Middle Ages. I discussed about it in some videos that, however, I think I've never fully addressed the rebirth of the year 2000, of the year 1000 in a specific video. But excuse me, I'm searching for the playlist, so maybe I can give you some advice. Here it is, Medieval Society. So I've done a video called Early Medieval Premises for 11th Century Rebirth, which generally speaking deals with that a little. But there is, let's say, scattered formations even in the development of urban culture in medieval Europe, a lot in Castellation noble families in post-Carolingian Europe, 12th century Renaissance and introduction, even the European commercial expansion during the 13th century, although that is chiefly related to the international routes and traffics, forests in the early and high Middle Ages, and also in castellation and territorial organization in 9th, 10th century Europe. But I will have to talk about really how this whole thing started, so that maybe you can understand better, but probably many of you, most of you, I hope at least, will already know what it really was about. So today we will concentrate, as we were saying, on the German lands. And those historiographical terms I was using before in German are very meaningful because they are present surely also in other countries' historiographies, say national historiographies. But in the German one, they definitely have a particular meaning because for the Germans, the Drang nach Osten was a very founding moment, partly also of Germanic identity, of German identity, let's say better. And I don't want to load this with nationalistic thoughts, because this is not definitely what I want, the impression I want to give. But it's definitely important because it was a moment into which Germany basically expanded into countries that were different, were chiefly Slavs, also of other populations of different origin, which was often, by the way, a very violent expansion, but not only, as most of the expansions taking place at this time, really, because violence military expansion were pretty standard approach, let's say, to the to these projects of, let's say, of territorial reorganization and all. I mean, it was the normal dialectics, both in the German lands and in the areas of Eastern Europe that hadn't known the German expansion up to that point. So what is more meaningful, what we will discuss today, is essentially the integration part, let's say the construction part of this system, because it's very, very fascinating for many reasons, and now we will explain. But I was saying that this phase is very important in German history because, in a certain sense, the German identity was built through the relation with someone who appeared as different. In my medieval German playlist, I made a lot of videos in which I explain substantially why let's say how national the German identity was formed. In medieval terms, we can only talk about proto-national terms, but also relatively to Germany, it's very the whole concept is, as for any other nation, by the way, is very controversial, because actually the medieval Germany was this essentially cluster of dukedoms, of duchies, that historically speaking had a Germanic identity, but were considering themselves all as different peoples in practice. This was caused originally, first of all, by the ethnic repartitions that existed into Germany as from the migration era, some cases even from before, and also because Germany wasn't at all a unitary thing, even geographically speaking. I mean, this still had this time, at the beginning of the push towards the east, Germany was substantially a pretty wild territory itself. The Drang nach Osten occurred, generally speaking, also within same Germany, today in same soil of Germany, by the way, because Germany usually finished on the Elbe River, which doesn't today, exactly for this. Obviously the push arrived far east, up to Russia practically, and even beyond in certain cases. But generally speaking, Germany was pretty much diverse in itself. Think about these forests and swamps that covered the whole country, and then sometimes divided. Even these sort of dukes of dukedoms that represented, in theory, still this original ethnical repartition that at that time didn't exist anymore, because it was essentially the local aristocracies that were pushing for the, let's say, the local ethnic identity to stress their own prerogatives, but really the local populations were very mixed with, first of all, within themselves in Germany, but also from colons coming from other places. Those were areas that already, since Merovingian times in part, had been, especially Franconia, that takes name from the Franks, in fact, had been sort of colonized. So the push towards the east, in a certain sense, is a meta-historical thing in the medieval times, in the sense that even the Franks from Francia were substantially pushing towards the east. That's what Charles the Great did. Yet nobody talks about Drang nach Osten for Charlemagne. Yet it's part of that, and this is why also we want to put in discussion the nationalistic approach, because at this time a true German identity didn't really exist. There was this Teutonic kingdom that had been created after the partition of the Carolingian Empire, that was substantially conceived as a sort of a place where people spoke a similar language and was a sort of common cultural background. But the single communities still preferred, first of all, they hated each other guts, also for reasons that eventually occurred because of the creation of the German monarchy, essentially, and and all the various interests that existed, conflictual interests that existed between among the various dukes, the various electors, but also because objectively it was very difficult to say where Germany finished. First of all, where Germany began, because certain areas of Western Europe were also relatively intensely Germanized, and especially one characteristic of Germany in its eastern frontier is that, historically speaking, it's always been very complicated to determine where it started. At this time, the Holy Roman Empire, in its German-Italian axis, let's say, comprehended also Burgundy. It was mostly a French, so a Romance-speaking language. It included Bohemia. That, by the way, was originally a duchy, then it evolved into a kingdom on its own, which was a Slavic land. Yet even these Slavic lands were intensely Germanized at a certain point. Even Western Poland was strongly Germanized, especially during the Drang Nach Osten. So, and there were especially at the eastern gates of Germany, these, many populations that in a certain measure were still semi-nomadic. I mean, the Slavs, by the time of the Low Middle Ages, were more or less settled down. But there had been wide movements of the Slavic populations, and think also about the Turkic stock populations, like the Magyars, for instance, that had settled into Hungary and had eventually been, let's say, absorbed into the German orbit since the time of the Teutonians. There had been waves of the Mongols in the 13th century. So and previously there had been the Cumans. It had been a very dynamic place. So this involved that practically Germany in itself was a sort of permanent frontier. And even the military nature of the Germanic of the Germans that was sometimes stressed this time, partly derived from this, partly derived from the fact that, as we've seen, the environment was still pretty wild. So the German communities lived, let's say, in less civilized fashion that it could be, I don't know, into Italy, into Germany, into France, or even England in a certain measure, because they had to rely on, let's say, a less sedentary lifestyle, which involved more action in some form, more conflictuality for the resources and all. Then Germany underwent, especially since the 12th century, a process of, let's say, of civilization, I don't want to use the adjective civil here, or civilized in a sort of positivistic fashion. It's just to say that basically into Germany the world of the forest is claimed much later. And it's already at this time that Germany is put in motion, so in relative delay compared to other areas of Western Europe, and really there were bonifications, there were deforestation, so the expansion of the arable land that had started already in other countries before, and that had pushed towards the east, that was in this sense the area that had not known practically civilization of the at least in the measure that had been known in the Roman Empire and post-Roman world. In this sense, also Germany is in itself. Within Germany itself, you can see this because the Rhineland, for instance, had been Romanized. The lands south of the Danube had been Romanized. There were Roman cities. The trade was more intense. They bordered with regions that were more economical dynamic. Northern France and northern Italy that were the most economically dynamic areas of Europe. So there had been a process of, let's say, of civilization. Think about even in literature, chivalric literature, the Minnesänger. The Minnesänger were mostly Bavarian. So these were areas that had known, let's say, this Frankization and feudalization in a measure that had allowed, or better, these were regions that were capable of absorbing such cultural influences because there were the premises, the society, the infrastructures, the wealth, the surplus in order to dedicate yourself to other activities and to appreciate them. Central Germany, Northern Germany were very, let's say, tough lands still, very wild in many ways. Excuse me, I drink a little. And the Drang Nach Osten went in parallel, we can say, with the feudalization of Germany. Let's say that by the 13th century, essentially Germany, with all its peculiar characters, and became a full feudalized land, and this equated to essentially the transformation of German society and the different forms of economical, territorial, political organizations that went beyond Germany, started favoring towards the east. And this is a very complicated part. I will discuss about this process in detail in another video because I can't objectively be exhaustive, and this is simply a summarization, summary, I don't know how to say that. And the leaders, let's say the one of the most important forces that led the push towards the east was the very dynamic political and military Teutonic Order. The Teutonic Order, also in here, this is not a video about the Teutonic Order proper. It is rather about how the Teutonic Order managed to direct this expansion towards the east. The Teutonic Order, in short, was a chivalric monastic order that, like many others that had been born in the Holy Land, in the Near East, and it was an order aimed at protecting the German pilgrims, because at this time, basically, the European universities were often split into national bases. Like if you see the university proper, so the schools, but even if you see the merchant corporations, they were based on the nationes in Latin. So this concept of whoever spoke more or less the same language. So even the chivalric monastic orders had this, and sometimes this kind of organization. Actually, the monastic chivalric order were usually pretty international, multi-ethnical. But the fact that it was a German monastic order in this sense it's meaningful because Germany cared about its sort of, say, of Teutonic identity. In fact, you see that this is this is not the German order. It's really a Teutonic Order. That was the name that was attributed to this, the Teutici, so-called, so the Germans proper, as they were conceived at the time. That eventually, however, didn't have a great development into the Near East, but rather into Europe. Originally, it was a house founded. It had a house founded to the Kingdom of Hungary, that in this sense was already framed partly into the economical expansion of the Western merchants into the area. The Kingdom of Hungary did let settle lots of Westerners, chiefly Germans, but also Frenchmen, Italians, English, Spanish, a lot of people. Also knights, because the Hungarian crown was searching for knights on the Western model. I was in turn feudalizing in part. And the settlement of this German monastic order was, chivalric order also, was seen fit. But eventually the greatest development of the Teutonic Order happened into northern Germany, into Germany proper, too, and pushing towards the east. And so the expansion of the Teutonic Order has to be conceived, obviously, as I was saying. I'm not going into detail now, but it's still important to frame this European expansion that took various directions, also into religious meanings, like the Crusades. The Baltic Crusades of the East weren't conceived at the time the Baltic Crusades. I mean, this is a historiographical concept that we use essentially to distinguish, didactically speaking, from. But let's say that all the Crusades into the Holy Land, into Spain, into the Baltic Sea, and partly also even in far north. Think about the Celtic fringe. Think about other forms of expansion, including the Norman conquest of Sicily. There are various crusades that were waged in many ways. So the idea was not just expanding economically, but also religiously speaking, within populations that were mostly pagan. Some of them were already Christianized, or maybe had Christianized to escape the conquest, by the way, because this has also happened. There were crusaders exterminating other Christians that were that had, because essentially they didn't care much. They just wanted to seize enough power for themselves by deeming them to be either heretic or simply pagan. So the Teutonic Order was on the lead in the progressive framing of let's say of the southeastern Baltic lands into a very robust form of organization. That was the feudal one, essentially, which was in turn proceeding with a very great work of colonization. And let's say that the military protection and political guide of these knights, monks, essentially, was really fundamental. And relatively to the idea of the crusade, we should say that actually the Baltic Crusades were the most effective of the whole Christendom, because they were the ones that had a more orderly frame, who had a longer success. It is true also in Spain there is a bit like this, because eventually the whole Iberian Peninsula was Christianized. I mean, the Reconquista brought to the full Christianization of Spain. But first of all, it's something that took much longer, at least in relative terms. But in that case, there was also a much higher degree of ambiguity relatively to the, first of all, it wasn't a unitary lead, because the Christian kingdoms of Iberia were let's say, more often battling against each other, especially after the 13th century, starting from the 13th century, than with, even before, by the way, than with the Muslims. Secondly, even their forms of expansions in this sense fared into lands that were already pretty civilized, because the Moorish lands were pretty rich, pretty wealthy, pretty I mean, southern Spain was richer than the north, generally speaking. Obviously, as we know, in the Holy Land, the Crusaders were defeated by the Muslims. The Baltic lands instead were framed into were essentially englobed, were inserted into a Christian system that remained such since the beginning, and it was essentially organized by a unique authority. There was essentially the Teutonic one. This is all the more interesting because, telling the truth, the populations that the Teutonic Knights invested were pretty warlike, were pretty, we can't say strong, because actually they had very weak political and military systems, but they weren't easy to curb. And even the Poles and the Russians had tried before the Germans to defeat these populations, but they had failed mostly. Also in here it happened because both Poland and Russia weren't very structural lands. So when the Teutonic Knights arrived, they kind of proved that Western feudalism was something that really had an edge over the other forms of political organization. This is not really a Western character. I mean, it is a Western character in the measure into which the West had better environmental conditions than Eastern Europe, which is pretty much self-evident. So it's not that the Poles or the Russians were bad, and the Germans were this intrinsically super force. It's simply that they had the resources and the methods and the structures to build up a solid domain. It was very well administered. The Teutonic lands in Baltic were in many ways very advanced, administratively speaking. They didn't go on to form a national monarchy proper, because eventually Prussia was definitely the bulk of the the Hohenzollern power, and partly there was a national nature attached to it. But aside from the fact that those lands have always been multi-ethnical since those very times, the German idea was that, first of all, that was not really a nation. It was maybe a bunch of communities that with common origin, common German identity, that, however, were still framed in this sort of religious order at the beginning, and eventually also into a sort of feudal net of relations. So it's very when you study German history, you have to understand it was mostly a federal-minded culture, for which there is definitely a common sort of proto-national identity, but a national identity at a certain point. But the important thing is the local community. It's really the sum of the communities that all have their own differences, and not really the whole thing that is mostly something that is mostly a facade. This is something that the Germans had since the very ancient times. I mean, when they built up confederations, those confederations had a name that was essentially the international name, their war name. But the various tribes that formed the confederation still felt themselves to be those specific tribes and not the name of the confederation. This is very meaningful. This is why southwestern Germany is named Swabia and not Alemannia, because the local inhabitants, in spite of having settled there as Alemanni, were still individually considering themselves as Swabians, and that's the reason why we call Swabia southwestern Germany into history, and not Alemannia anymore. So this is very important to understand really what the German identity was in those places. You know that the East Germans have been also historically speaking, up to the last century, a very strong presence in the Baltic Sea. What is interesting is that in spite of the of all the difficult relations that definitely existed at many times throughout all history, think at all the wars that have been fought during the Middle Ages or the Modern Age into those areas. Overall, these were relatively pacific multi-ethnic societies. Obviously, there were the guys at the top that were mostly the Germans that exploited local populations, but overall, even this original so-called German settlers actually were in part Polish, for instance. So it wasn't much the idea of these were areas, those communities were used to live together, as it happened in most the Middle Ages. Also because partly they were encouraged to settle in there. We mentioned before the case of Hungary, that is pretty meaningful. Hungary's always had very consistent Germanic communities there, and they all had their own rights recognized by the monarchy and all. So because this is how really feudal Europe worked. It was essentially a cluster of communities who were defended by a sovereign power, and that's pretty much it. And the idea of nation state is something that destroys this practically, and fuels that is something that comes very late in time, especially into Central and Eastern Europe, and something that destroys this harmony, let's say this equilibrium, and instead starts ethnocides and persecutions and deportations and all that. They're all typical of the 20th century, mostly, not only, but that in that century really reshaped the ethnical geography of Europe, as we sadly know. So these are chapters. I'm not going to discuss about this now, but these are very important chapters in European identity that many people slowly haven't got over with, in the sense that I live in a country where fortunately ethnic cleansing has practically never happened, if not in extremely confined cases that obviously still they're bad as all the others. But if you live into other regions of Europe, you realize that there is it's because it's also very recent past. There are people who are still alive who have lived through that, so the memory is still fresh, and also part of the national identities were built over that ethnic cleansing. And this is why nationalism is wrong, because it's not a simple form of patriotism, of loving your own country. It's really about saying, I'm better than you just because I speak this language or identify as this with this flag, and you don't. And I hope we'll get over this soon. And the key of doing this is studying history. You can't do this. You can't spend beautiful words about that. You can say all you like. You can make all your beautiful Facebook posts. But if you do not study history, you can't get over this, because you will never know. If you don't know how it happened, you can't understand it. And this is really the key of the whole situation. And we must say that relatively to the expansion, first of all, we mentioned that the Baltic Crusades were in southeast of the Baltic, because the north of the Baltic was Christianized, essentially, even if the Scandinavian kingdoms weren't this particular strong. And the interesting thing about this is that actually the Scandinavians had begun partly to settle especially into Livonia. Think about the Danes, because it was really the Danish who started this, because the Danish were the richest guys. They aren't Scandinavians, but let's say they fit in the block of together with the Swedish and the Norwegians. But they had too few resources. The North was too poor at a point. It was Germany, really, this big giant, was waking up. at that time that eventually took over. In fact, if I'm not wrong, the Teutonic Knights partly bought the feudal rights of Livonia from the Danish or something like that at one point. Also because these lands had to be kept well, and as far as I know, the Danes had achieved a relatively more superficial degree of colonization. Also the Swedes did something, but it was really the Germans, as we were saying, that had the big resources, that had big feudal structures, and that eventually took over. And also I would like to say this, that sometimes we attach to really the Teutonic Knights this sort of privilege of having conquered the Baltic lands, but telling the truth, the Teutonic Knights, even if they were pretty exclusive-minded, and as we will see how, they really were happy of people coming there, like, I don't know, knights or people who wanted to join the communities, because obviously there was, first of all, an economical gain from this. We are in times into which the demographical increase is still very, very short, so if you want to populate one area fast, that's through immigration. And so all these cities that were founded by the Teutonic Knights were given very consistent rights and privileges, so to attract many people from many places to go settle in there. This invested mostly also the poorest regions of Germany that were pretty tough areas to live with, and sometimes certain parts of the Baltic Sea had been, say, bonified in a measure that were a more suitable place to go living than other regions of Germany. Or simply there were regions of Germany in this sense that had experienced demographic growth, but the local soil wasn't fertile enough to sustain that exceedancy of humans, and therefore they had to migrate into, especially were lots of Westphalians, if I'm not wrong, of Saxons in this sense, that went there. But what I was caring about is that, especially among the German nobility, and not only, also the Western Slavic nobility, so Bohemians and Polish, there was a great, it was a sort of good thing to do, to go to the Crusades in the East. Great kings like Ottokar II of Bohemia, for instance, but also many Germans. Think about the Tannhäuser, the famous German poet that went missing, let's say, into the Baltic Crusades. I mean, as the French and the Italians went crusading into the Holy Land, and or maybe into Spain, so did the English. The Germans and the Slavs went crusading into the East, which meant, just like in the other crusading areas, that maybe you went there for some months just to fight the pagans, and then you came back home just to claim, oh yes, I'm a crusader, I've fought in there, I've achieved certain feats, because really also the feudal elite was pretty much involved. I mean, the feudal elite had a genuine taste for war and bloodshed, and even obviously if the thing is more complicated and more rationally based, in the sense that there was definitely an income deriving from participating to these crusades. There was also sort of cultural lust and attraction for these crusades. The taste of adventure was there in many ways. So it's important to understand that also this Baltic world is not this isolated place far here, there in the northeast of Europe. It's, you know, it's also an open space. And it is exactly through the Drang nach Osten that it enters into the Western sphere, let's say, and this was supported obviously also by trade, because really all the interest for these lands. I mean, why did the Teutonic Knights went into the Baltic lands and not into I don't know, into the Carpathians? I mean, yeah, partially there is some German penetration there as well, but why those lands? Because those lands were definitely had a very great strategic importance in terms of controlling the trade that was developing between Russia, the north of Russia, chiefly Novgorod, this important trade center in the north. At this time, eventually, the central and southern Russia is wiped out by Mongols. So there is say, an instability that hits there. Novgorod is actually a very powerful city that keeps this importance in trading all the furs, all the timber, wax, and all these things towards the west, and also grain. England expanded. I mean, England bought resources coming from there, and that's how the Hanseatic League was formed, by the way. Because really the idea is that there is this northern traffics between the Baltic and the North Sea that began to develop pretty intensely. There isn't just this trade between North and Southern Europe as an axis from north-south. There is also this axis west and east that through the northern seas was practicable, and the Hanseatic League was crucial in this because these were Germans that had, in this sense, privileges also into the Teutonic lands. You know, the Teutonic cities had usually the rights of Magdeburg, that were the set of rights, a set of standard rights, let's say, that was extended to the cities founded by the Teutonic Order. But there were others, I don't remember which, I think only one, but it was a major one, that had the Lübecks right. Lübeck was the first and most important city of the Hanseatic League. It had been founded also in there in the 12th century. Actually, it already existed, then it went destroyed during the clashes with the Slavs, because that's how the Slavic world, how west the Slavic world actually was at that point. Lübeck has, by the way, a Slavic etymology also, in as many Eastern German cities, like the even the suffix "witz" actually comes from the Slavic "vice," which I think it's the Slavic for village. Also, von Clausewitz was a picture I use as an avatar. He was, first of all, he had well, we were talking about the modern. If not almost the contemporary era. He had Polish origins partly, but he came von Clausewitz with it, you know, the Witz is from Vice. I don't know, from the Klaus, which sounds a bit German, but in this sense you have to understand how these lands between Eastern Germany and the Slavic world were so very much blended together, culturally speaking. And Lübeck and the Hanseatic League made a lot of money in shifting these goods from Russia essentially to the west, just like the Italians did the same by shifting the goods between Central Europe and the Mediterranean. So the Hanseatic League did. So I still haven't made a video about the Hanseatic League, but I will have to. By the way, the cities of the Hanseatic League, I went there in vacations. They're amazing. They're amazing. If you visit Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck, and Rostock too, but there are many others. You can't really breathe that air Stralsund too, by the way. Stralsund is a beautiful place. Well, whatever. Now let's stick to our Teutonic Knights. But what I want to say is that even these Germanic lands were definitely, these Teutonic lands in the Balts were in the Baltic countries were, let's say, they differed. I mean, Prussia was very different from Livonia, for instance, and also very different, let's say, geological, I don't know, say, but the terrain, the environment is very different. Also the great importance into this was the ecclesiastical administration, because when this is generally a leitmotif of medieval history, is that wherever Christianity expanded, it began to build up dioceses. Now you know that the diocese is since the Roman times the actual cornerstone of the let's say ecclesiastical administration. It is not just a merely spiritual affair, but it was also a way of first of all, the diocese settled into urban centers. This was the main character, with a few exceptions, like in Ireland, but we're talking about the early Middle Ages. Dioceses basically overlapped with monasteries, because in Ireland there weren't cities, and this partially remained at the beginning of the it also influenced the Anglo-Saxon church up to a certain point when it was re-Romanized, let's say, but at this time in the feudal world, definitely the dioceses corresponded to the foundation of a new urban center. So you can argue that Christianization went in parallel with urbanization, which meant in turn that the urban center was the essentially the place from which the Christians controlled strategically the whole territory, because it's an entrenched or even walled town. The Teutonic Knights left beautiful fortifications all over the Baltic countries. If you want to see that, if you look at you know, the beautiful castles that exist still in there, very beautiful places. I've never been there in vacations, but I'd love to as a medievalist, because there are some of the most beautiful medieval architecture that you can find. So it was really a new model of political and territorial organization. It was definitely very different from the one of the local populations that dwelt in the Baltic lands. And the bishops had a huge importance into this. The popes controlled definitely the Baltic Crusades. They decided which diocese had to be founded or not. At this time, by the way, it's Frederick II that from Italy. There are many councils where wherever he was wandering to Italy, clashing against the Pope. By the way, that were you know, disposing how the territorial administration of the Baltic lands had to be administered, because these were the Teutonic Knights, whereas they were responding to Frederick II as German king. But at this time, strategically speaking, the monastic orders were in the 13th century were in decline, and the universal power of the empire was essentially the only authority that could keep them standing. So even the Templars and the Hospitallers were pretty tied to Frederick II, and he directed them but definitely Frederick was being half German. He he felt really his also his German sovereign's duties, and definitely he considered the expansion of the Teutonic Order as also as a very profitable investment also for an imperial authority, because these chivalric monastic orders weren't private possessions. I mean, they really belonged to the church in a certain measure. So, as a German king, Frederick could control them, and in this sense, forming lands that responded to him and not to the local nobility, as was very important, and that's why also bishops had such a big power. Although this could vary in the sense that in there even the papal influence could intermingle. So extremely complicated things. I'm not an expert, but I will have to touch that topic too sooner or later, because it's also very important. I think one of the most important characters of the Drang nach Osten is really the change that occurred into the Baltic landscape, because indeed the Baltic Crusades literally changed the face of very vast regions of Europe, and chiefly by the clearance and of the land and the transformation into arable surface, the foundation of a really uncountable number of villages that were formed more or less spontaneously in certain cases, but also of roughly 100 cities, besides all the castles and churches that were founded in there. And these regions had never known anything like that, because they were chiefly, I mean, Prussia was, historically speaking, a bit wealthier than Livonia. Livonia is, if you go in the hinterland, is a terrible territory, because it's all covered in forests, in swamps. So this is part of the reason why it was sometimes also very tough to win the populations that lived in there, because the main difficulty was even, you know, having the local bases for accumulating resources and for, you know, and they needed to make them arrive by sea sometime in there, because also the land roads were impracticable. In winter they were extremely cold. Everything froze, and in spring all this ice melted and created this marshy, extremely also how do I say that, boggy and sludgy ground that was practically impassable. Also, strategically speaking, you have to think that the Teutonic armies were largely feudal armies with heavy cavalry, and you cannot make those armies pass through marshy terrain and through forests, because there is no way out. I mean, sometimes we think that these ancient medieval world was this purely natural world where the humans ran free as. No, there were areas where nobody could pass, because simply entering there could mean not coming out of there alive anymore, not coming out of there in the first place, physically speaking. It was extremely dangerous to venture there, also because mobility was very low, was very reduced already for those times, viabilities, let's say. Then, let's say if you were too late in a certain time of the year in your military campaign, it could happen that the terrain changed because it got flooded and you couldn't come back, so that you basically starved to death into these lands. And telling the truth, exactly for the marshy terrain, the Teutonic Knights preferred to actually move into winter, when the rivers froze, because that was the only moment to which the terrain was solid enough to pass with an army. This is how also the Mongols did. The Mongols invaded Russia in winter, and they conquered it, by the way. So the myth that Russia cannot be conquered in winter can work maybe for Napoleon and for Hitler, but it doesn't work. It didn't work for the Mongols, because that's what was really the only way to reach some places. So it was a very tough expansion, by the way. It wasn't so easy. It's not a the Teutonic the Teutonic Knights arrived and they started building everything from scratch with a snap. It was an extremely tough, heavy work that really exhausted, I think, also many resources. I don't know in terms also of profit how on the long run how it went, because by the way the Teutonic Knights at a point were defeated by Poland. There was, by the way, the kingdom where they had settled. This is a very interesting thing, because Prussia actually was a vassal. It was a fief of the Polish crown that the Teutonic Knights took, and this is also very interesting because it proves how we're talking about meta-statal entities. I mean, these knights were a monastic order. They were not a state, even if they built one de facto, but they were simply guys who were claiming to a local lord, local sovereign, can we settle here? And the locals said, yeah, why not? And this is how it happened with the Poles, incidentally. So there was a lot of warfare, as I think all of you are aware, which was also extremely crude, extremely violent. The Germans carried out the extermination of entire tribes, of entire populations that up to that time had lived, inhabited those lands since a very old time. I think the Lithuanians, but I think also the Prussians. The Prussians were not the ones of Frederick the Great. The Prussians were originally the people from which Prussia took the name. They were practically wiped out and were erased from history because of the Teutonic invasions. And many of these peoples actually understood. They were largely pagans. This is very important. Actually, Lithuania, that was the major power there, and that was a bitter enemy with the Teutonic Knights, could afford not to convert to Christianity basically up to the 14th century, where eventually they did. The history of Lithuania is extremely fascinating because it has very peculiar characters, but it also was very important in the strategical balance of Eastern Europe, because there were times into which the Lithuanians they had the foot into stirrups, different stirrups. From one side, they were pretty much involved into the Russian affairs. For the other, in the Polish ones, and incidentally in the Western ones, because the Poles were Catholic, were Germanized, would say Westernized. And at one point, the problem of the Lithuanians was, do I convert to Orthodoxy or to Catholicism? Because that equated to expand either east or west. Eventually, as we know, they chose Catholicism. They allied with the Poles, so that in the 80s, if I'm not wrong, in the 14th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was created. It lasted up to the end of the 18th century, when it was partitioned gradually between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, so that Poland disappeared from the map. It had been up to that point a very big power, a very big power into Eastern Europe. And then Poland, aside from the Grand Duchy of Warsaw during Napoleonic times, it re-emerged, let's say, on the political maps of Europe only after World War I. So you understand a lot of political gaming, and these local populations, however, most of them, I mean, Lithuania in this phase also got partly westernized. So it was a power to be reckoned with, but initially there were lots of smaller tribes who didn't make it and were progressively either incorporated or exterminated by the Teutonic Knights. And some of them, as was saying, yeah, they were converted to Christianity even before the Teutonic Knights arrived, because they had smelled, in a certain sense, that that would have happened. So just like the Scandinavians had done sometimes, like the Danish had done, for instance, in Ottonian times, in order to prevent the Christian powers to invade them with the excuse that they were pagans, they converted to Christianity. But in certain cases this didn't work for them, because in certain cases the Teutonic Knights slaughtered certain local populations, certain local communities that had already converted to Christianity and maybe weren't even hostile to the Teutonic Knights, but for them it was simple. It was enough to claim that. For the Teutonic Knights, it was enough to claim that those were pagans to get the papal okay for slaughtering them. And this is very sad, but it actually occurred. And it's really a dark page of history, as you know, most of history actually. However, this is also how the whole thing happened, and this is also partly and sadly how why the Teutonic lands were so efficiently administered, because basically who stood against them was wiped out. So this is something that you could do in the East. In the West it wasn't possible. And it wasn't possible because the feudal system had produced a lot of seigneuries that couldn't be wiped out like those poor tribes. Because they had castles, they had a whole different form of political and military organizations. A bunch of villagers made up instead those Baltic communities. What opposition could they made? They could do that, and they definitely kept doing that, but many of them simply were destroyed. So there was also a lot of you know, of recollocations, let's say, of a relocation of peoples in this sense, also because there was the need of labor force to build up literally this new lands, let's say. So there was a lot of collaboration too, in some measure. So also a share into the gains. And generally speaking, together with the Drang Nach Osten, in parallel went a great sedentarization, essentially, of those Baltic populations, because up to that time they had been substantially semi-nomadic. Instead, now the new political and social models of Western mold, let's say, implied that these peoples had to settle down, definitely. So most of these peoples were also transformed into serfs. It goes without saying, I think. So this is the labor force we were talking about before. There was a labor force that was organized by the German and Polish colonists, so the Teutonic Order was controlling a society in radical change. The great qualities of this order were essentially hierarchization, homogeneity, where the knights, the members of the order that were in majority recruited within the German aristocracy, made up basically the ruling class. So they had they had to take perpetual vows. There was a very strong spiritual commitment of these people. Actually, the monastic life of these knights was pretty. We know that from sources, was pretty harsh. I mean, these still lived truly as monks rather than than aristocrats. Obviously, there was a sort of social elitism into this, because as we've seen, there were mostly nobles from birth. But it was a very stern, Spartan world. Also very, I think also about the environments. I mean, these cold areas that, most of the year they're extremely dark. In these wild lands, mostly hostile for at least, especially in the previous times. So the 13th century was still a very poor world, especially here in the east. As we have said, Germany was developing as economically speaking, but also the German world compared to the Western one was already, was still more primitive in many ways. So it was a dark world. This is how at least I imagine it, especially in the first times of the conquests, and so relatively to this ruling class of Teutonic knights, there were other levels in the hierarchy that were essentially the priests and the so-called sergeant monks. So those people who essentially could remain within the community to help. Even just for a brief amount of time, essentially, and then coming back from where they came from, so which was very different compared to the Teutonic Knights proper, that had a lifetime commitment. Was a lot of chastity involved. Really, it was a strongly the religious nature of this was important in many ways, because it really informed the whole system. I mean, the same administration was based on a monastic and ecclesiastical fashion. And that's why it was so homogeneous, because, by the way, the church in this sense was at the time one of the best administered entities in the West. Like, the papacy was structuring at the time a very sophisticated form of also of bureaucracy in part. So one of the great, let's say, one of the great advantages that carving this power in the East was that you, as we were saying before, that you didn't have to deal with the extremely crowded and extremely complicated political and social system of Western Europe. You could essentially erase everything, make a sort of tabula rasa, and building a new state from scratch. So all the problems of decentralizations that were implied by feudalism were in a certain sense surpassed, and giving an ecclesiastical direction to these lands was equated to having a much more centralized control, and a much more efficient one. So this was really one of the most important characters of the world situation. So there were, and as we've seen, the Teutonic Knights allowed the participation of many other people that could enter to be part of the order, and to and to even let's say dwell in there for a limited amount of time, so that they wouldn't root their personal interest into there, and it would simply support, so making their crusade experience, let's say, and serving God and all, and then coming back without creating too many problems like the settlement of new aristocracies and all. This was a great thing, let's say, to do for a 13th century state. From the end of the 13th, there were also other small orders. For instance, there were the Livonian brothers of the swords that were in Latin they were called Fratres Militiae Christi Livonia, so the brothers of the Christ's militia of Livonia. In German, Schwerpunkt, so order of the brothers of the swords, and in French, Ordre des Chevaliers Porte-Glaive. So we have various, even here it was sort of multi-ethnic participation after all. There was, as we said, there was a German dominance, but at the same time also other elements, especially of knightly class, were definitely welcomed in a certain measure. So, but from the end of the 13th century, the great master of the order, of the Teutonic Order, that was elected to life, this is also very interesting, took permanent residence in the Marienburg Castle in Prussia. Marienburg is also a beautiful castle, you can still see, amazing, and this was really the Teutonic headquarter, and from here the Great Master governs all the central and peripheral structures of the order, and more generally on a strategical level the political coordination of the Baltic domains. So at this point Prussia was basically subdivided into various political administrative districts that were entrusted to commendators and bailiffs. So these are figures that were definitely appearing similarly also into the feudal, the administration of national monarchies in the West as part of the most advanced administrative structures, either to certain procurators that were all knights monks, and as knights monks were also the prince, the greater functionaries of the very efficient bureaucracy of the order was rooted at every level of society. So you understand here a very direct control all over the system that had been created. So when people say, oh, in the Middle Ages there wasn't centralization because it was all feudal and there wasn't even the idea of centralization, this is completely false. The reason why in most of Europe, of medieval Europe, the government was mostly decentralized. First of all, it doesn't erase the fact that it was partly decentralized but still centralized in some measure, because otherwise it cannot be a government. Secondly, it was something created by the contingencies of the situation, and when you see, like in here in Prussia, that all those contingencies had basically wiped out because it was possible to build a new political entity from scratch, you can't see in there that centralization was pretty a pretty obvious thing to do, like in any other time in history, if there was the possibility of doing it. So obviously it wasn't also here nothing centralized like a 19th century nation state. However, it was still something that had its own, definitely its own pretty solid structure for the time, and this is definitely a witness of the, the capabilities of the Western mindset at the time. So another very, the bureaucratic efficiency of the Teutonic Order also was also reflected by at the economical level, because essentially the Teutonic Knights created a sort of monopolium, a financial monopolium, into their lands, which basically was extended to merchants at the point of excluding essentially the other competitors that weren't German, or at least that weren't depending on the Teutonic Order. This was a very important thing to do because, as we have said, the Baltic Crusades went in parallel with a great economical organization. So it was very important also in here to be the first one to basically seize the local rights of exploitation of the resources, of the various trade rights and all. And the Jews and the Italian bankers that operated in even in very close lands, like in Poland, like in Galicia, in Krakow, in Leopolis, were kept out. The Jews, because the Jews were at the time the only ones that were practically allowed to that were allowed to create, basically to carry out credit, like, I don't know how to say that way. Excuse me, there were some noises. Sometimes I stop because there are noises that bother me, and I try to push them away. So the Jews were the only ones who were allowed usury by law, because they were conceived as non-Christians. So they it was a very clever way for Christian powers to say, let's make someone staying here making usury, because we need that for our economies. But let's them do to the Jews only, because those won't be saved. We don't care. Those were kept out by the Teutonic lands, as well as the Italian bankers, because the Italian bankers were basically dominating the European markets at the time. So the Teutonic Order knew that these Italians would have come in there as well, because they were, as we've seen also in Poland, and they kept them out. So they basically reserved the local activities to the Germans, or however to those who decided who could stay in there. And merchants, by the way, well, merchants have definitely a degree of rooting into the society, because they settle into the cities, they build their own corporations, their own administrative institutions and all. But at the same time, there's still people who were relatively detached, let's say, from the local life, in the sense that they are mobile. Merchants at this time, especially, they are still usually on the march. They haven't, especially in the northeast of Europe, the local rooting on the merchants with very developed institutions is not really there. There is a great degree of mobility, of itinerance. I don't know how to say that. So they are also easily, you can extromit them if you want at a certain point. It was normal at this time in other areas of Europe that when you were at war with someone, you basically confiscated all the properties of the merchants of that enemy state that you were fighting with. This happened all the time. Then eventually merchants came back because when war was over, trade had to go on. because it was advantageous for all involved. So there was this kind of enmity also between certain national merchants and all. So the main trade products of the Teutonic lands were definitely grain and amber. So grain, as we said it before, they came mostly from Russia, and it was very welcome on especially in the northern markets, because even if it was cheaper than the one that arrived from the Mediterranean, at least it was more advantageous at a certain point not to depend exclusively from one market. And especially to countries like, I think, the north of Europe, and if I'm not wrong, England especially, because eventually England and Russia, even in the modern age, developed this very important trade. Russia began to specialize itself in grain exports. It was sold even in Spain. I mean, but this in later times. But let's say that in the 13th century, these broad international markets start to pop out, essentially. But also amber, and amber had always been a very precious resource since the ancient world. And the amber road into Europe definitely started from the Baltic Sea, where there was a lot of amber, and it passed through Poland, then to Central Europe, and arrived to northeastern Italy. And there was also a lot of other entrepreneurial activities and craftsmen. So the you have to think also of the bourgeoisie that sort of was emerging into the newly founded lands. There was a lot of activity in milling and also in tanning. These were all products that normally arrived from the let's say the wilder lands in the east, and that passed through these centers usually on the coast. So even these products came from the mainland, and then there was an immediate strategic advantage of building cities in there for this reason, so that you could export them directly without passing through any other place where maybe the local lord could exact tolls or stuff like that. So the Teutonic Order had a very strong influence also on the ecclesiastical entities like bishoprics, the cathedral chapters, and even on the parishes, because these were really conceived as a sort of hierarchy in the local administration, part of the local administration in practice. This had been done always, especially in those countries of new Christianization, let's say. Even the parishes were so small, but were definitely very important, because they were the ones who were present really at the bottom of the ladder, and could control directly the local communities. So if there was some fear of that that certain communities maintained paganism as a form of resistance to the local Christian government that could be spotted, stuff like that. But at the same time, the Teutonic Order managed first of all the settlement, very peaky settlement of various monastic communities. There were certain monastic communities were kept out because they were feared to be interfering with local administration. Others instead were accepted. So this is really how deep they went in terms of territorial control. And I repeat, this is very important because this is something you don't find elsewhere or so easily in Europe. Okay, so for now I think it's enough. Another day we'll discuss about the, let's say, the second part of the Teutonic history, and mostly what it has to do with especially the international relations, in the sense that eventually there was a lot of warfare we didn't talk about, but definitely that definitely occurred. Also very complicated relations with the local powers. All things that we have necessarily to talk about. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested to receive further news about my contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!